The dusty plains of Arizona stretched endlessly beneath a scorching sun, the horizon shimmering like a heated mirage. The only sound was the low groan of wind pushing through jagged canyon walls, carrying with it the scent of dry sage and desert sand. Ethan Cole, a weather-worn cowboy with a lean build and the steady eyes of a man who had seen too much, was tracking a herd of wild mustangs. His boots crunched over brittle earth as he moved quietly, his hand resting near the worn handle of his Colt revolver, every sense tuned to the wilderness around him. It was then he saw it, a thin column of smoke curling upward in the distance, rising against the pale blue sky. It wasn't the smoke of a campfire. It was darker, denser, angry. His jaw tightened. Trouble. From far off, he thought he heard faint cries carried on the wind. He paused, scanning the horizon, then swung into the saddle. His Mustang, a chestnut mare with a scar across her flank, sensed his urgency and broke into a gallop, hooves thundering across the parched ground. The closer they got, the clearer the sound became. Shouts, screams, the distant pounding of horses. As Ethan crested a low ridge, the scene below came into view, and his stomach twisted. The Apache settlement was in chaos. Smoke poured from burning lodges, flames devouring their wooden frames. Men and women scrambled to save what they could, dragging children away from the danger. Raiders, rough men on fast horses, tore through the camp, firing rifles, kicking over water barrels, and shouting curses. The air was thick with dust and the acrid stench of burning wood. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to keep riding, to avoid getting caught in someone else's war, but his boots didn't turn his horse. In the middle of it all, he saw her. Naya, she stood like an unshaken pillar among the destruction, tall, strong, her dark braid whipping in the wind. She was no helpless bystander. Her eyes blazed with fury and command. In one hand, she clutched a bow, loosing arrows at the attackers with deadly precision. But she was outnumbered, and her people were being driven to ruin. Ethan had seen warriors before, but there was something different about her. A depth, a weight to her presence that pulled him toward her like a magnetic force. She saw him before he could decide his next move, her gaze locked on his, sharp and unyielding. Without hesitation, she crossed the chaos toward him, stepping over debris and fallen baskets. She reached him, her breathing heavy but steady. Without asking who he was or why he was there, she gripped his forearm with a strength that startled him. Her voice, low but fierce, cut through the roar of the fire and gunfire. "Save my tribe," she said, each word deliberate, "and I will give you strong offspring." There was no flirtation in her tone, no playfulness, only a vow heavy with meaning. Ethan froze for a moment, her words sinking into the dust. Filled air between them. He was a man of the West, familiar with bargaining for cattle, horses, or gold. But this was different. This was a promise rooted not in desire, but in survival. He searched her face, finding no hint of fear, only resolve. Around them the camp burned, and the cries of frightened children clawed at his conscience. Without another word, he swung down from his horse and checked his revolver. "Point me to where I'm needed," he said flatly. Her grip released, but her eyes never left his. They moved quickly. Naya led him through the chaos, her steps sure despite the destruction around them. She barked orders in her native tongue, directing the remaining warriors to protect the children and drive the women toward the canyon. Ethan kept low, his revolver steady in his hand. The raiders were spread thin, too confident in their numbers. He took advantage of that, moving from cover to cover, firing precise shots that dropped 2 attackers before they even saw him. The settlers in town called him a quiet man, but in moments like this, he was pure instinct and steel. A sudden crack split the air, a rifle shot close. Ethan ducked behind an overturned cart, the splinters flying where his head had been. Naya crouched beside him, her bow drawn. She loosed an arrow in one smooth motion, and somewhere ahead, a man cried out and fell. She didn't look to see if he was dead. She simply moved to the next target. Together, they pushed forward step by step until they reached the center of the settlement. The largest lodge was already engulfed in flames, and the heat pushed them back. Ethan's jaw clenched. Every second counted. Then he saw them. 3 young boys trapped behind a collapsed beam, the fire closing in fast. Without thinking, he charged through the smoke, his shirt sleeve catching a lick of flame before he beat it out. He lifted the beam with a grunt, the weight straining his shoulders, and shouted for the boys to crawl free. They scrambled toward Naya, who pulled them to safety. The relief in her eyes was fleeting. The battle was far from over. Shouts rose from the far edge of camp. More raiders were circling back, intent on finishing what they'd started. Ethan knew they couldn't fight forever. "We need high ground," he said, coughing through the smoke. Naya nodded and motioned for the remaining warriors to fall back toward the cliffs behind the settlement. The narrow paths there could be defended more easily. They moved as fast as the wounded would allow, arrows and bullets whistling past them. Twice, Ethan stopped to fire back, buying precious seconds for the others to advance. Naya stayed close, her bow still in her grip, her breathing steady despite the chaos. She was a fighter, but more than that, she was a leader, holding her people together. When they reached the rocky slope, Ethan turned and spotted a raider charging straight for them on horseback. The man's rifle was raised, ready to fire. In a heartbeat, Ethan drew his revolver and shot the man clean out of the saddle. The horse bolted, disappearing into the canyon. The warriors cheered, but Naya simply looked at Ethan with a nod. No words, just the acknowledgement of a debt growing between them. The battle had shifted. The raiders, now facing resistance and losing ground, began to retreat. But Ethan knew they would be back. This was only a reprieve. As the dust settled and the fires smoldered, the cost became clear. The Apache settlement lay in ruins. Several warriors were wounded, and families huddled together, clutching what little they had saved. Ethan stood among them, his chest still heaving from the fight. Naya approached, her expression unreadable. She looked over her people, then back at him. "You fought like one of us," she said quietly. "But this is not over. They will return, and when they do, my promise still stands." Her words hung in the cooling desert air, heavy and certain. Ethan didn't reply, not yet. The sun dipped low, staining the sky in deep shades of orange and red. Shadows stretched across the canyon walls, and the wind carried the smell of ash. Ethan walked to the edge of the camp, looking out at the horizon where the raiders had vanished. He wasn't a man who stayed in one place for long, but something about Naya, his words, and the way she had stood unshaken amid the fire, settled deep in his bones. He knew the fight wasn't finished, and neither was whatever strange path had just opened between them. Ethan could have walked away. The raiders weren't his burden to carry, and every instinct of survival whispered to leave. Yet when his eyes met Naya's, something in her steady gaze burned into him. A silent challenge, a call to stand where most would falter. He had seen that look before, long ago on a battlefield that was now only memory. Without a second thought, he swung into action, rallying the few uninjured men who still had the strength to fight. Fear gripped them, but his calm voice and unyielding stance steadied their shaking hands. He studied the rocky terrain surrounding the camp, every ridge and shadow a potential advantage. The raiders, overconfident in their numbers, pushed closer without guarding their flanks. Ethan's mind moved like a chess master's, piecing together a plan that could turn desperation into victory. He divided the men into pairs, instructing them to move silently through the gullies. Dust swirled in the evening air, masking their movements. The distant crack of gunfire echoed against the cliffs. The attack came like a whisper before the storm. Hidden in the rocks above, Ethan and his makeshift fighters struck with precision. Bullets snapped through the air, finding targets before the raiders could even take proper cover. The smell of gunpowder thickened the air, mingling with the sharp scent of dust and sweat. The raiders faltered, caught between the chaos behind them and the fierce resistance ahead. Ethan's rifle never missed its mark, each shot placed with the cold focus of a man who understood what it meant to fight for something worth dying for. The battle surged like a living thing, twisting and changing with each heartbeat. Raiders scrambled for shelter, but the high ground gave Ethan's group the edge. Sparks burst from rocks as stray bullets ricocheted, sending shards into the air. A young fighter beside Ethan cried out, clutching a bleeding arm. But Ethan pulled him back, patched the wound with quick, practiced hands, and pushed him to safety. There was no time for hesitation. Every second lost was another step toward defeat. As the sun dipped lower, the cliffs cast deep shadows across the battlefield. Ethan used the fading light to his advantage, shifting positions before the raiders could pinpoint his location. His mind stayed locked on the plan, his heart pounding but steady. Through the roar of gunfire, he could hear Naya's voice rallying her people from the camp center. Her courage was a beacon in the chaos, and the fighters drew strength from her presence, pressing forward with renewed determination. The turning point came when Ethan spotted the raider leader signaling for retreat. With one final push, his fighters drove them back across the rocky pass. The sound of retreating footsteps mixed with the shouts of defiance from the camp. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the gunfire ceased. The cliffs echoed with the fading noise, leaving behind only the heavy breathing of the survivors and the acrid smell of smoke drifting over the camp. Ethan lowered his rifle, scanning the damage. The camp was scarred, tents torn, supplies scattered, and the ground stained with the cost of their defense. Yet it still stood. Survivors began emerging from hiding, their eyes wide with disbelief that they were still alive. Some clasped his shoulders in silent thanks, while others simply stared, unsure how to reconcile the stranger in their midst with the man who had just saved them. Ethan said nothing, his gaze searching for one face among the crowd. He found Naya near the center of camp, standing tall, despite the exhaustion etched into her features. Her eyes, sharp as flint, softened when they met his. For a moment the noise around them faded, replaced by a heavy silence. She stepped closer, her voice steady, but laced with emotion. "You didn't just save my tribe," she said quietly. "You've bound your name to our story." The weight of her words was heavier than any medal or prize he had ever known. Ethan tipped his hat, unsure how to respond. He had heard promises and gratitude before, but something about Naya's words felt different, permanent. He remembered her earlier warning, the half-promise of what might come if he proved himself. Now, with the smoke still curling from the cliffs and the cries of the wounded behind them, he wondered if she truly meant it. Yet deep inside, he knew the truth. Whatever happened next, this moment had already changed him. Night fell over the camp, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows on the jagged walls of the canyon. The tribe gathered to tend the wounded, repair what could be saved, and honor those who had fallen. Ethan sat apart for a while, sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a small comfort in the aftermath of chaos. Naya approached again, this time carrying a small clay cup of water. She handed it to him without a word, and for a while they simply sat in silence. In the quiet, Ethan thought of the road ahead. The raiders would not forget this loss, and they would return, stronger, angrier, and ready to claim what they believed was theirs. But the camp was no longer defenseless. He had seen the fire in their eyes now, and he knew they would stand again if they had to. For his part, Ethan felt no pull to leave. Something in this place, in Naya, told him his journey here was far from over. The night deepened, stars spreading across the desert sky like shards of broken glass. A soft wind moved through the canyon, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush and the promise of coming trials. Ethan rested his rifle within arm's reach, his hat tilted forward as if in sleep, though his ears remained alert to every sound. Somewhere in the shadows, Naya's quiet voice carried to him, speaking to her people of courage, unity, and the stranger who had fought as one of their own. When dawn broke, the camp awoke to a new day, battered but unbroken. The wounds of the night before would take time to heal, but already the people moved with renewed purpose. They rebuilt their walls, set guards at the perimeter, and prepared for whatever came next. Ethan joined them without being asked, working alongside men and women who now met his gaze with respect rather than suspicion. Whatever path had brought him here, he knew it had been the right one. By evening, the camp had regained a sense of rhythm. Laughter, cautious but real, began to return. Children darted between the tents, and the smell of cooking fires filled the air. Ethan sat near the edge of camp, cleaning his rifle, when Naya appeared once more. She didn't speak at first, only watched him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Finally, she said, "The promise you made wasn't just to me. It was to all of us." He met her gaze and for the first time allowed himself to believe it.